You're listening to The Means of Production, the origin story of WRIR and community-powered radio in Richmond. I'm Whitney Whiting.
It was very, very difficult to become an on-air personality. On FM and on television and anywhere else, it was very, very difficult.
Most of us don't understand what it takes to create that space and why the controls are there. Like, what's the threat? What's the problem? Why can't you just let people occupy these spaces?
You know, the experts are the ones that run all those commercial radio stations that were so unsatisfactory in Richmond. It's like, if that's what the experts do, then maybe we should let the amateurs have a crack at it.
And now we're going to go to the grassroots. We're going to talk about another controversy that's raging that really goes to the heart of media and democracy. It's the issue of low power or micro radio.
The basic debate is whether or not the federal government, through the Federal Communications Commission, should grant licenses for community groups to make use of the FM airwaves by running what are called low-power or micro radio stations.
That was Democracy Now!'s Amy Goodman speaking with Michael Bracey of the Low Power Radio Coalition at the height of a media debate that was shaking the radio industry in the late 90s. Despite heavy pushback from major broadcasters, by the year 2000, the FCC was prepared to allow low-power, community-driven radio stations, just like WRIR, onto the airwaves.
Now Federal Communications Chairman William Kennard.
Tomorrow we will bring to a vote in this very room items dealing with low-power FM radio service, which, if adopted, will increase access of Americans to
the moment came after years of organizing and agitating by radio pirates across the country. The pirates, those running small, unlicensed stations in defiance of the FCC and corporate monopoly of the airwaves, were surprised to find themselves on the same side as their one-time political foe, FCC Chairman William Kennard. Kennard had led multiple raids against pirate stations in his first months as head of the agency. So how did media activists arrive at this new tipping point? How did someone like Pete Treatish, for instance, go from unlicensed radio pirate to low-power radio advocate?
Right about 96, 97, the repercussions of the 1996 Telecom Act are really being felt really hard.
Moving.
Yeah, it's very fast moving. It's slaughtered 2/3 of the industry.
WRIR co-founder Chris Maxwell.
And so all that energy had to go somewhere. And so a lot of them started pirate stations, a lot of them started internet stuff. Some of it went into whole new broadcast discussion areas. And then really the pirate activity had gotten strong enough that there was a lot of energy coalescing around, no airplanes are falling out of the sky because these guys are on the air.
The technology improved, the availability of chips that could keep you locked on your frequency, and also the fact that we were working at low powers.
Pete Treatish was an activist in Philadelphia when he helped start Radio Mutiny, a highly successful pirate radio station reaching thousands of residents with a very tiny piece of technology.
The small transmitters we were able to build packed a remarkable punch for how cheap they were. It was amazing to us. We thought you needed a tower and we thought you needed like a big room full of transmitter stuff, but no, we were able to cover a good portion of our city with 20, 40 watts.
You were shut down by the FCC?
I was part of a Radio Mutiny collective in Philadelphia, which was an unlicensed radio station. We basically saw our unlicensed broadcast as an act of civil disobedience against the way that the media is owned.
Only moments ago, there was dead air on this frequency, but an entirely different kind of radio is about to start broadcasting in this formerly empty space.
The Federal Communications Commissions would rather have you hearing dead air than hearing our voices.
It was real exciting because there's really nothing like a neighborhood radio station to, sort of form the nexus of new ways of creating local democracy.
By 1998, radio pirates had been hitting the airwaves hard, and government harassment only made them stronger. the new head of the FCC, William Kennard, found himself in an awkward position. On one hand was his duty-bound obligation to shut down illegal pirate radio activity, and on the other, a legitimate grievance that he actually shared with the radio pirates.
When you first became chairman, you had concerns about media concentration, and then over the last 2 years, there's been, in my experience, an unprecedented flow of concentration. Have your views evolved on that at all?
I'm still quite concerned about the extent of consolidation in the media marketplace.
Kennard was a Democratic commissioner. He was a corporate guy, but he was the first African-American commissioner, and he had been involved in civil rights communications law for a long time. And yet he presided over a terrible consolidation of media as a result of the Telecom Act of 1996.
Something like the internet comes along, and immediately some people react by saying, well, you need to immediately deregulate all of our ownership restrictions. Well, that's not appropriate, because we know that those rules were put in place because they preserved long-cherished values about a multiplicity of voices in the media.
So media consolidation is happening at an alarming rate. What little bit of diversity had existed in media ownership had been cut in half, and pirate and micro broadcasters are at an all-time high.
So there's obviously a maelstrom of everything going on. Enough pirates are getting powerful enough. And then here comes a really key moment. FCC Commissioner William Kennard, he went to South Africa ostensibly on a mission to tell them that they should do everything the same way Americans do.
Sort of a typical political junket. He was trying to encourage them to allow American cell phone companies to build there and all that kind of thing. And they take him around. And of course, at that time,
South Africa's ANC, or African National Council, had just won democratic elections a few years prior, and the majority black population was coming out of decades of forced racial segregation, also known as apartheid.
Everyone thought the ANC was the coolest thing in the world. They had just fought apartheid, and they were rebuilding their society to get rid of the apartheid state. So they took him to a radio station called Bush Radio, which was run by a guy named Zain Ibrahim. Zain had operated a pirate radio station under apartheid from over the border. One of the early things that the new administration did was they created new licensing for community organizations, and Zain applied for one of these licenses in South Africa and got one. Zain took them around the station, and it was just a very cool place.
The story goes that at some point in his tour of Bush Radio, Kennard turned to Zain and said,
there are these people in the United States that run pirate stations, and they say they would like to get licenses sort of like this. What do you think? And Zain told me, he was like, look, get rid of your advisors. And he took him over to a bar, and Bush Radio was playing on the air, and he was saying hi to everyone. And Zain says to Kennard, he's like, you mean to tell me that you've been free of the British for 200 years and you guys still can't do what we can do in South Africa after only a year and a half? You have the power to do this and you haven't even done it yet? Of course you should give them radio stations.
And he realized these things are a way better run than I thought they were going to be. They're doing amazing services for their community that none of the official stations could be bothered with. William Kennard came back to the United States convinced that the South Africans had a better system than we did. So Kennard said, you know what? We've already got literally thousands of pirate broadcasters. We keep shutting them down and they just keep restarting. Equipment has gotten so cheap. And Kennard came back convinced that it was workable, it was really useful to the body politic. So he was converted by the pirates.
Hi, this is Roger Skinner. Thanks for checking out our website. We're trying to make America better by creating Low Power FM. Can't do it alone. We need your help. So file those comments at the FCC. Call your congressman. Together we can make it happen. Let's go.
Go, go, go.
Kennard may have been convinced by the pirates, but now it was up to the pirates to actually get on board. It's important to note that the radio pirates didn't make up the entire movement. Their direct actions had pushed the issue into the national spotlight, but the movement to open up the airwaves was really much broader than that. And there were all kinds of ideas of what a new community radio service could look like.
There's thousands of people in this movement. So there were people saying, well, no, it shouldn't be nonprofit. We should be allowed to have commercial stations up to 3 kilowatts with anybody allowed to apply. And the other end of the spectrum, people like, no, it should never be more than 1 watt. So you had every kind of proposal you could imagine before the FCC had any kind of formal rulemaking. So, the communities had to discuss and kind of coalesce around some range of proposals.
And some of the radio pirates remained wary of the FCC's intentions. Back in Richmond, Virginia, Max had already been crusading for a legal form of independent community radio for years, a project he was calling Radio Free Richmond. He saw the popularity of pirate radio early on, but in his mind, it had to be legal, because the whole point of community radio was to be a space for underrepresented voices. And the problem with pirate radio...
The problem with pirate radio is you can't get political minorities on it. It's an illegal station. As soon as you gather up enough energy and you tell enough people where it is so that they can access it, well, guess who else shows up? The police. Yeah, I'm going to get white dudes out the wazoo because they don't care. They're not going to face any serious repercussions. But black women, white women, black men, they ain't going to show up for that.
But we should note, not all radio pirates were white men. There were plenty of women in DIY radio too. And some of the earliest and most defiant radio pirates, like Mbana Kantako of Springfield, Illinois, inspired Black liberation radio pirates all over the country, including right here in Richmond. But for many people, pirate radio was a risk that they couldn't take.
Right? So there's no way to have full access for real people unless they can be safe. They have to be safe, right? And pirate radio is not safe.
And Pete was beginning to see this at Philadelphia's Radio Mutiny as well.
For instance, there was this woman, and she had been a radio journalist in Ethiopia. She was really interested in our station. She wanted to be part of it. And she was about to do her first show, and she called and she's just like, I'm sorry. I love your station. I listen to your station, but I can't be there when they burst through the door and start arresting people. I can't do that. And we heard that from a number of people that just weren't willing to take the same kinds of risks that we were. And I ultimately came to believe that the important thing that we were doing was not so much breaking the FCC's regulations, fun as that was, to stick our tongue out at them and everything. But the important thing that we were doing was we were broadening the cross-section of people that could be on the airwaves. So when the opportunity for legalization came, I had no doubt in my mind that the more radical thing to do was taking it through legalization so that we would see a whole different cross-section of society that was actually on the airwaves than what was before we started. Free speech wasn't only for people that had nothing to lose, but for everybody.
And with the new proposals for low power, or LPFM, Max could finally tell people that the possibility for safe community radio was within reach. Here's Anna Edwards, host of the Defenders Live.
Somewhere in there, I know we met Chris Maxwell. I don't remember at what event. And he was talking about, trying to get this radio station started. And so I used to hear a little bit about the challenges that they were going through. And he would say, Congress is doing this. And I was like, I did not understand why Congress was involved in whether or not you could start a local radio station. But, it's like, well, they're working all that stuff out.
The FCC had just changed the way their website worked, where they allowed public comments through their website. They had the most public comments of any issue the FCC had ever had. It was ultimately 4,000 different groups all across the political spectrum: radical right, radical left, churches, private groups, fire stations. Everything you can imagine. We're like, yeah, this is a great idea.
This new category of low-power radio would be for non-profit, non-commercial stations operating at 100 watts, and the comments in favor came from all over the country. Max himself collected over 400 signatures from people in and around Richmond. His petitions are still archived on the FCC website today, and they feature names of people who would one day be WRIR volunteers, like Dustin Richardson.
It's prohibitively expensive for a community organization to have a traditional FM radio license. A traditional FCC license requires all kinds of very expensive engineering studies, an engineer to be on staff or on call 24 hours a day. And so this low-power FM radio license was created, which was a step-down, simplified version of an FCC license that allowed normal folks like us to kludge together a bunch of dumpstered equipment and get a radio station on the air. So the need was identified. These early senators were on board with it. Congress people were on board with it. FCC was on board with it. And then steps in the lobbyist from the National Association of Broadcast and said, okay, hold your horses. Well, you know.
Media Money, the National Association of Broadcasters, begins their national convention in San Francisco. They say micro radio interferes with their business. Media activists believe the NAB interferes with their democracy. All that and more coming up on Pacifica Radio's Democracy.
You know, the industry, the radio industry lobbied very heavily against this.
WRIR DJ Bill Lupoletti.
And the two groups that lobbied the most strongly against it were the National Association of Broadcasters, which is the lobbying arm of all the commercial radio stations in America, and the other one was National Public Radio.
So what is NPR's role in all this?
Well, NPR's role is unfortunately really shameful. And I'd like to differentiate between all of NPR, because there are lots of folks at NPR that actually support this, and a sort of thin layer of imperious bean counters at the top of NPR who feel very threatened by the possibility of low-power radio.
So what was the argument? Why were the NAB and NPR so opposed to low-power FM?
Destroy radio as we know it.
Yeah, it was destroy radio as you know it, because all these noobs don't know how to operate a station. Airplanes are going to be falling out of the sky. They're going to be mucking with our signals so our listeners can't hear us, because they're going to create interference patterns.
It's going to cause chaos and havoc all across the radio spectrum. They're going to be stepping on our signals that we paid a lot of money to protect.
Chaos and havoc. That was literally what they said. In fact, one comment from the NAB stated, quote, allowing any interested citizen to have his or her own radio station, no matter how small, would cause chaos and wreak havoc on the broadcasting industry. The NAB virtually refused to give any size allowance of low-power FM, claiming that no matter how low-power the station, it would damage the technical integrity of the broadcast spectrum. But in the case of low-power FM, the small size or low wattage of a station's transmitter is the whole point. Here's former RIR board president, James Hickman.
And there was this push to allow this in an area that wasn't legally allowed. The contracts for low-power FM were, there was a reason why the big radio stations were able to shout and argue about it. Because the way that law was written was, if you own a radio station, you're somewhere around 50 to 100,000 watts probably, or 30 to 100,000 watts a radio station. The next station on the dial is going to be three adjacents from that, third adjacent.
James is referring to a common regulation in the FM radio space called third adjacency. Here's what that means. Because full-power FM stations have such high transmission power, or signal output, they have to follow certain allocation rules so that their signals don't interfere with one another. Third adjacency refers to the amount of empty, unoccupied space on the FM band between each full-power station. So let's say you're listening to 101.3 on a traditional FM radio dial. If you travel up the FM band toward 101.5 and 101.7, you probably won't hear another clear signal come through until 101.9. The FCC ensures that those adjacent frequencies on either side of 101.3 remain empty in order to prevent signal interference. And when your digital car radio scans for radio stations, it's looking for that next occupied frequency and skipping over all the third adjacent empty static.
So what they did was they allowed these low-power FM stations to get in between those third adjacents and saying they're such a low power that they're not going to infringe on you, reaching your target audience.
But that's exactly what the NAB took issue with. They called it bleed-through or interference. The proponents for LPFM called it a red herring. Here's Liz Humes.
Full power stations, both nonprofit and for-profit, rallied against the existence of low power, and what they were worried about was, among other things, was bleed through, and that our signal would bleed into theirs.
But if you know how FM radio signals work, this doesn't really add up.
So WRIR has 100 watts. The power of the transmitter that WRIR started out with was a 100-watt transmitter. That is exactly the same as a 100-watt light bulb.
By comparison, full power stations operate at thousands of watts, sometimes as much as 50 to 100,000. To use Dustin's analogy, imagine you're on a football field. All the stadium lights are out except for a 100-watt light bulb placed in the center at the starting line. That 100 watts will cast light in a limited radius, but you'll be able to see it from almost anywhere in the darkened stadium. Now imagine someone comes and turns on the megawatt halogen lights in the arena. The light from the 100-watt bulb is now completely inconsequential. It can't possibly compete with the power of the stadium lights. The same would be true for a 100-watt transmitter in range of a full power station. The engineers at the FCC analyzed various technical scenarios and concluded quite confidently that it was possible to place thousands of low-power stations across the country between existing full-power stations. But the NAB would eventually lobby Congress hard to apply the standard third adjacency rule to low-power FM as well.
Now that's ridiculous. There's no way we could even get a transmitter to bleed that far away from our central frequency in the spectrum. But they said it like that because they knew that most cities had too many radio stations to even allow that much dead space between a central frequency. By default, it would eliminate the threat of community radio against these members of the National Association of Broadcasters. They didn't want a groundswell of community radio because they knew that would draw away listeners, and then they couldn't charge as much for advertising.
This would later prove to be a huge setback for LPFM. But in the beginning, at the FCC, the NAB's lobbying fell on mostly deaf ears. And some elected officials closer to home were very much in favor of LPFM. Here's Bill Lupoletti again.
Politicians from both parties were big advocates, and a big advocate in favor of this turned out to be Tim Kaine. He was mayor of Richmond at the time, and Kaine was much more interested in this subject than Chris had ever expected.
There were 4,000 groups who had said, yes, we think this is a great idea.
But as Max looked at the comments coming into the FCC website, he started to notice
every place in the United States was very well represented except the Southeast. So I went to, at that time, newly minted mayor, guy you probably know named Tim Kaine, and said, hey, we need a resolution before City Council saying we love the concept of the low-power radio service.
And in a serendipitous turn of events, unbeknownst to Max, Kaine had already been selected to serve on an FCC advisory group that convened municipal leaders to examine how FCC rules impact communities at the local level. Not only that, but Kaine himself had his own background in DIY low-power radio.
And he writes this thing that is like, if you wanted to have something written better, it could not have been done. This was not just some low-level pretend resolution. He went into the meaty, juicy, substantive reasons why this was essential. And
Mayor Tim Kaine's resolution came before the Richmond City Council on April 12, 1999, just before the initial round of comments were due to the FCC. It passed unanimously.
So we sent it up to all the usual suspects, Congress critters, senators, the FCC, of course. And then I heard back. Somebody called me. I forget who it was. It might have been Petri Dish. Somebody called me up and said, hey, they're going to pass it.
Tomorrow we will bring to a vote in this very room items dealing with low-power FM radio service.
Max canceled his plans for January 20th and drove the 2 or so hours from Richmond, Virginia to Washington, D.C. to witness the FCC vote for himself.
And they pass it. And I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I got to witness them passing the first regulation that reverses the consolidation from the last 30 years. And I got to sit in the audience, and I was a big part of it. So then after they finished, and I'm just sitting there wondering what I'm going to do, this FCC staffer walks right over to me. I wish I'd gotten her name. She walks right up to me. Like, no wandering, just walks straight up to me. She says, are you Christopher Maxwell? And I don't have a name tag on. I said, yeah. She said, I wanted you to know that our staff said your resolution made it possible for us to go to the FCC and say every corner of the United States wants this. And they said, yes, let's do it.
Part of what I heard with that story was we expected Madison, Wisconsin and Berkeley, California and but when the capital of the Confederacy shows up with their resolution of the substantive, declarative, it was all done.
Yeah.
It tipped the scales.
We just dumb luck, whatever, knowledge of technology, knowing the right people, just...
Alan Shinsius had a phrase for this kind of thing. He called it cosmic origami. When people and events and circumstances out of your control line up just perfectly. Because as much as you plan and plot and strategize, there are some things that even the most experienced organizers can't plan for. Chance occurrences like the right person, someone like a Tim Kaine or a Zain Ibrahim, showing up at the right place at just the right time. And for some reason, those chance occurrences are all over this story. More to come in the next episode of The Means of Production. Special thanks to Pete Treatish, Christopher Maxwell, Liz Humes, Anna Edwards, James Hickman, Bill Lupoletti, Dustin Richardson, and Fareed Alan Shinsius. And thank you to the folks at Sound Museum Collective for use of their Radio Mutiny audio collection. Visit soundmuseumcollective.bandcamp.com for more pirate radio archives. This episode featured archival audio from C-SPAN at cspan.org and also from Democracy Now! Show archives. Visit democracynow.org for media coverage going back to 1996. Music for this episode came from the Free Music Archive, including tracks by Taylor Hobynum, Tomas Fujiwara Duo, Lobo Loco, What Cheer Brigade, Barnacled, and Nozu. Find past episodes of The Means of Production at soundcloud.com/anotherrichmond. Until next time, I'm Whitney Whiting, reminding you that another Richmond is possible.